Sorry for that little interruption. It was a calendar notation that came up on my phone and was kind of disturbing me. So anyway, let's continue here. So let me repeat that last couple of sentences there. Government intervention would hamper the development of a great modern enterprise, the New York Times opined in an editorial published 3 weeks before the Titanic's sinking. The pathways of the ether should not be involved in red tape, the Times said. The Titanic tragedy changed everything. The public was outraged and the press demanded immediate government action. The recent disaster to the Titanic points with terrible and fateful directness to the absolute necessity of a controlling power to regulate wireless telegraphy, declared the popular magazine Electrical World in an editorial. No measures of repression are too severe. 4 months later, Congress passed the Radio Act of 1912. Among the law's provisions were requirements that all radio operators be licensed by the Department of Commerce, that senders of malicious messages be prosecuted and fined, and that transmissions by amateur operators be restricted to the less desirable shortwave band of the spectrum, an ethereal ghetto, as one historian would describe it. Radio's Wild West days were over. Neither the tragedy nor the new law dampened Americans' love for radio. As sales of sets soared in the boom years after the First World War, large companies moved into the market, quickly filling the void left by the amateurs' banishment. In 1920, Westinghouse Electric founded the country's first commercial station, KDKA, in Pittsburgh. It was a sensation. The initial broadcast, heavily promoted by Westinghouse, came on election night when announcers gave rapt listeners up-to-the-minute results of the presidential race between Warren Harding and James Cox. Between announcements of the returns, reported the Pittsburgh Gazette-Times, radiophone music was transmitted, which added much to the entertainment. Within 2 years, more than 500 commercial stations were operating across the country, and radios had become the new centerpieces of American living rooms. Their broadcasts gave daily testimony to the miracles of science and technology. Even in an age of marvels, wrote one Ohioan, there is something awe-inspiring about the radio. Through the radio, the throbbing present may be brought home to us and the dead past made to live again. End quote. Radio sets were changing, though. While hobbyists, or hams, continued to buy or build transceivers, most of the models sold to the general public lacked the capacity to send out signals. They could only receive them. Radio, it was now clear, would be a centralized medium, in its programs and its influence flowing out in a single direction, from the broadcaster to the masses, from the one to the many. Public callings. In a 1922 article in Popular Science Monthly, Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce in the Harding administration, celebrated the wildfire spread of radio, which he called much more amazing than any other thing we have seen in our time. The future president was excited and optimistic about the new technology, seeing it as a tool for elevating the public mind. We are witnessing, he wrote, a dawn glowing with the promise of profound influence on public education and public welfare. Every home with a radio, he said, may confidently look forward to the receipt from the air of an ever-increasing quantity of important and interesting information from many sources that have never before been so accessible to the American public. But Hoover saw dangers as well. He understood that broadcasting's uniquely pervasive presence, as Justice Stevens would describe it decades later, was fated to change society in deep and unpredictable ways. Radio stations, through their selection of what to broadcast and what not to broadcast, would hold considerable sway over listeners' thoughts, habits, and even votes. The wireless would shape the country's culture and its politics for better or for worse. It was obvious to Hoover and to pretty much everyone else at the time that the public had an interest in broadcasting that went well beyond turning the tuning knob. As with the secrecy of correspondence doctrine, the idea that certain businesses ought to be responsive to the public interest had a long heritage. It derived from a centuries-old distinction between companies that have strictly private callings and those that also have public callings. The Supreme Court explained the distinction in an 1877 decision, upholding the government's right to regulate grain storage facilities. Property does become clothed with a public interest when used in a manner to make it of public consequence and affect the community at large, the justices wrote. When, therefore, one devotes his property to a use in which the public has an interest, he in effect grants to the public an interest in that use and must submit to be controlled by the public for the common good. End quote. Broadcasting is not grain storage. Because it deals in the intangible goods that shape public opinion, facts and ideas, news and comment, it is inherently political. That broadcasting had a public calling may have been obvious in the 1920s, but the nature of the calling was not. Without any precedent to draw on, society had to figure out more or less from scratch how to accommodate the powerful new technology, how to tap its benefits while curbing its destructive potential. It was a complicated, daunting challenge, requiring that the interests of the community at large be balanced not just against the interests of private enterprise, but also against the interests of individuals, including the right to freedom of expression. The broadcast spectrum's limited capacity made the challenge all the more pressing. The government would have to decide which applicants were worthy of a license and which weren't. Beginning in 1922, Hoover's Commerce Department convened a series of conferences aimed at bringing order to the increasingly congested and chaotic airwaves. Attending were representatives of government, industry, the military, and the listening public, along with prominent radio engineers and scientists. Much of the discussion involved technical issues, such as establishing equipment standards and reducing interference between stations. But political, economic, and social questions were also on the agenda. What criteria should be used in allocating spectrum? Should certain frequencies, clear channels, be set aside for nationwide stations? Should local stations, at the time mainly operated by universities or civic groups, be protected from large commercial networks? Should advertising be permitted? Should a balance of viewpoints be required? What roles should religious and educational programming play? Should political candidates and government officials be allowed to speak on the air? Even the question whether stations should be allowed to play recorded music rather than required to hire musicians to perform live was a matter of debate. The wide range of topics reflected Hoover's belief that, as he put it in a speech at one of the sessions, the ether is a public medium and its use must be for public benefit. In 1926, not long after the fourth of Hoover's conferences, the regulatory framework established under the Radio Act of 1912 crumbled when a federal judge ruled that the Department of Commerce had no authority to issue wireless licenses. The already crowded airwaves were soon overwhelmed by new and more powerful stations broadcasting overlapping signals. The cacophony infuriated the public. Looking to establish a legally sound process for regulating the spectrum and building on the work of Hoover's conferences, Congress passed a new Radio Act in 1927. Defining access to the airwaves as a privilege, the legislation mandated that radio stations serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity, an awkward phrase that would come to have a profound influence on the nation's communications policy. To enforce the public interest standard as it came to be known, the Act established an independent regulatory agency, the Federal Radio Commission, and gave it broad oversight authority. The FRC wielded that authority with vigor. In one famous case, the commission acted to stem the spread of medical misinformation over the airwaves. A doctor named John Brinkley, who had made a fortune transplanting goat testicles into men as a treatment for impotence, was operating his own radio station, KFKB, in Kansas. And a footnote adds, among the well-known patients of the goat gland doctor were Harry Chandler, the wealthy publisher of the Los Angeles Times, and J.J. Tobias, the chancellor of the University of Chicago's law school. Both men praised the efficacy of the transplants. Brinkley used the station in Kansas, one of the country's most popular, to promote a variety of quack treatments and medications, often offering specious and dangerous on-air diagnoses to listeners. In 1930, the FRC refused to renew Brinkley's broadcasting license, ruling that his programming, quote, is inimical to the public health and safety, and for that reason is not in the public interest, end quote. When the doctor appealed the decision claiming censorship, the Federal Appeals Court backed the commission. The FRC had not subjected Brinkley's broadcasting matter to scrutiny prior to its release, the court wrote, but it merely exercised its undoubted right to take note of appellant's past conduct, which is not censorship. Congress intended the FRC's extensive rulemaking powers to be temporary. Legislators still assumed that once various technical issues were worked out, the nascent radio industry would be able to regulate itself. Their hope proved vain. Controversies continued to swirl through the ether. With the even more expansive Communications Act of 1934, Congress replaced the FRC with a permanent body, the Federal Communications Commission, and widened the Commission's purview to include the personal communication systems of telephony and telegraphy, as well as, through subsequent amendments, the newly emerging broadcast medium of television. By combining the mandate that telephone and telegraph providers operate as common carriers with the mandate that broadcasters act in the public interest, the legislation formalized the two-pronged regulatory philosophy that would govern electronic communications in the country for most of the rest of the century. The Common Carriage Standard imposed clear, consistent guidelines on telecommunications companies. They had to transmit messages without prejudice and without violating the confidentiality of their contents. The Public Interest Standard was fuzzier. Neither the Radio Act nor the Communications Act defined exactly what it meant for broadcast to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. The interpretation was left to the Commission, subject to court review. Over the years, the standard's meaning was hashed out through dozens of cases, many involving years of deliberation. As the legal scholars Erwin Krasnow and Jack Goodman observed in a 1998 Law Review article, perhaps no single area of communications policy has generated as much scholarly discourse, judicial analysis, and political debate over the course of the last 70 years as has that simple directive to regulate in the public interest. End quote. The FCC itself, according to one of its former commissioners, oscillated wildly between enthusiasm for the public interest standard and distaste for it. Both the contentiousness and the flexibility of the rulemaking process could be seen in the way regulators, along with judges and lawmakers, struggled to address what has always been one of media's most charged issues: what to do about political bias in broadcasting. From its founding, the Federal Radio Commission had been concerned that stations would use their shows to promote the opinions of their owners and ignore or denigrate conflicting views. Control over a station, the commissioners worried, could turn into a monopoly over information. The public interest requires ample play for the free and fair competition of opposing views, the FRC declared in a 1929 ruling. The Federal Communications Commission went further in the 1940s. Responding to complaints that a station had used the airwaves for political lobbying, it prohibited broadcasters from promoting causes and candidates. The broadcaster cannot be an advocate, the commission decreed. The rule was immediately controversial, with many arguing it violated station owners' free speech and free press rights. The National Association of Broadcasters launched what one observer termed an all-out fight against the FCC. In response, the commission convened hearings on the issue in 1948, gathering the testimony of dozens of representatives from the broadcasting industry, the public, and various civic groups. The discussions led the FCC to establish what came to be known as the Fairness Doctrine. Under the new rule, stations were required to devote airtime to discussions of issues of interest to the local community, and while they could present their own opinions, they also had to allot time for other views. It is this right of the public to be informed, the Commission stressed, that forms the foundation stone of the American system of broadcasting. The Fairness Doctrine turned into another political battlefield. It was revisited and revised frequently over the years, and each update ignited new legal and political disputes. As the doctrine's fraught history suggests, the public interest standard is no magic bullet. Its amorphousness means that its interpretation will always be messy, combative, and provisional, as political processes tend to be in a democracy. Some legal scholars and pundits, particularly those with a libertarian bent, have argued that the standard's imprecision gives government regulators too much leeway. The standard, writes a typical critic, is vague to the point of vacuousness, providing neither guidance nor constraint. But that view, others argue, misses the point. The public interest standard is more than a legal principle, it's an ethical principle. It ensures the people's right to have a say in the workings of the institutions and systems that shape their lives, a right fundamental to a true democracy and a just society. The vagueness of the standard is necessary for a simple reason. In a pluralistic society, the public interest changes as the public mind changes. As the economist Gerhard Kolm observed, without some controversy about the changing meaning of the public interest, democracy would not be alive. Mass media and mass men. By the end of the 1930s, radio broadcasting in the United States had entered what's now called its golden age. The chaos of the early years had subsided. The governmental licensing regime had relieved congestion and interference, and technical advances in transmitters and receivers had greatly improved the quality of signals. The radio industry, dominated by large commercial networks such as NBC and CBS, but also encompassing many local and nonprofit stations, produced a variety of entertaining and informative shows that captivated listeners. More than 80% of households owned at least one radio, and the typical American had the set turned on for upwards of 4 hours a day. There was plenty to criticize about radio. Some popular shows, such as the notorious Amos and Andy, perpetuated then common racist and sexist stereotypes, and in granting broadcast licenses, the FCC routinely discriminated against members of minority groups. And a footnote adds, in the 1970s, the FCC shifted course, establishing a minority ownership task force and introducing tax incentives that led to a five-fold increase in minority ownership of stations. Intellectuals and moralists decried the mediocrity and vulgarity of commercial radio, with one prominent newspaper columnist, Robert Ruark, describing broadcasts as corny, strident, boresome, florid, inane, repetitive, irritating, offensive, moronic, adolescent, or nauseating. But whatever radio's flaws, the vast majority of Americans, urban and rural, poor and wealthy, highbrow and low, loved it. They made their feelings known through fan mail. During a single month in 1936, NBC received more than 1 million letters lauding its programs, its performers, even its advertisers. "Last night our baby was born during the victory hour," wrote one particularly enthusiastic listener, referring to a popular variety show starring Will Rogers and Al Jolson. "We're going to raise him on radio." Radio transmissions may have flowed in one direction only, but the postal network gave the audience a way to respond to the broadcasters. Fan mail formed a feedback loop. The networks used the incoming letters as market research, fine-tuning their programming and their ads to give listeners more of what they craved. Far from objecting to the rising commercialism of the airwaves, reports cultural historian Alice Goldfarb Marquis, the public enthusiastically embraced it. Franklin Roosevelt's popular fireside chats, heard by as many as 2/3 of U.S. adults, crystallized the essential role broadcasting had come to play in the country's culture and politics. The chats provoked their own flood of mail, with Americans sending the president thousands of letters a day, most expressing gratitude for his calming and optimistic words. Radio gave the nation a shared and generally hopeful soundtrack during the Depression, one of its darkest and most divisive times. Rather than rendering listeners inert and submissive, historians Lawrence and Cornelia Levine argue the wireless tended to counter passivity, to stimulate audiences to thought and action, and to give them a sense of participation and inclusion, often for the first time in their political lives. What radio did not do is bring peace, love, and understanding to the world. The medium spread darkness as well as light. If its effects in the United States and other Western democracies were generally benign, the picture was different in authoritarian states. Dictators found in the centralized medium, with its one-to-many channeling of information, a tool perfectly suited to thought control. In the Soviet Union, where tightly scripted broadcasts tended to be heard through public loudspeakers rather than private sets, the Bolshevik regime viewed radio as a means to reset the mental horizons of its population, in the words of historian Stephen Lovell. There was no feedback loop. What the audience wanted didn't matter. In Germany, the Nazis seized control of the state radio network the moment Hitler was appointed chancellor in January of 1933. Soon after, the Reich's communications chief, Joseph Goebbels, spearheaded an effort to build and distribute a cheap plastic radio, the Volksempfänger, with a tuning mechanism designed to pick up only German stations. Within a few years, most Germans owned one of the sets, through which poured, in addition to the Führer's interminable speeches, a steady stream of nationalistic and anti-Semitic propaganda. School children were often quizzed on the content of the broadcast to ensure they and their families were listening. It would not have been possible for us to take power or to use it in the ways we have without the radio, Goebbels said in a speech at a Berlin radio conference in the summer of 1933. Radio made it possible to carry out a principled transformation in the worldview of our entire society, a revolution of the greatest possible extent, he said. To control the nation's soundtrack was to be always inside its citizens' heads. That the spread of mass media was accompanied by the rise of Nazism and other totalitarian movements seemed like more than a coincidence to many observers. Broadcasting's centralized design, with its concentration of power and its tight control of information, seemed to mirror the political structure of the authoritarian state. In the United States and Europe, sociologists, anthropologists, and psychologists, along with journalists and policy analysts, began to suspect that radio and other systems of mass communication could, in the words of Stanford cultural historian Fred Turner, turn the individual personality and with it the structure of society as a whole in a totalitarian direction. Mass media, he said, might create mass men. Think tanks with names like the Institute for Propaganda Analysis were set up to study the issue. With the outbreak of World War II, the fears intensified. Nazi sympathizers in the United States began to use the airwaves to spread fascist ideas. The weekly broadcasts of the rabble-rousing pro-Hitler radio priest Charles Coughlin drew tens of millions of listeners. As the country prepared to enter the conflict, Turner reports, policymakers grappled with two questions. First, how could they convince democratic Americans to go to war without turning them into the sort of unthinking authoritarians they would be trying to defeat? And second, what kinds of media could they use to do it? The questions inspired a few dozen prominent intellectuals, including anthropologist Margaret Mead, psychologists Gordon Allport and Eric Fromm, pollster George Gallup, and art historian Arthur Upham Pope, to form, with the Roosevelt administration's backing, the Committee for National Morale. The goal was to examine the connections between communication, individual personality, and national character, with a view to undertaking a radical restructuring of media to make it less likely to serve as an arm of tyranny. If existing mass media built on the one-to-many model tended to produce an authoritarian personality, couldn't a new form of mass media built on a many-to-many model produce a democratic personality? During the war, members of the committee, notably Mead and her third husband, Gregory Bateson, a British anthropologist who had a sideline as an American spy, began to sketch out what such a communication system might look like. They imagined an immersive, interactive, multimedia environment. Information in all forms, text, image, sound, motion picture, would be presented to an active, engaged audience of citizens. No traditional editors or producers, no government bureaucrats or propagandists would script the experience. People would be free to choose what to look at and listen to at any given moment. Most important, the medium would erase the divide between creators and consumers. People wouldn't have to resort to the mail to make their feelings known. Everyone would have the tools and the network access needed to express themselves through the system. Everyone would have a voice. Information would flow in all directions at once. The Committee for National Morale shared Charles Cooley's faith in the rationality and goodwill of the public. An unconstrained, decentralized flow of information would open people's minds and arouse, as Cooley had put it, their higher sympathetic and aesthetic impulses. The vision of a decentralized, democratized media informed two expansive exhibitions staged at New York's Museum of Modern Art to support the war effort. 1942's renowned Road to Victory and its 1943 sequel, Airways to Peace. After the war, the vision, fusing the political and the aesthetic, continued to inspire intellectuals and avant-garde artists. It infused Edward Steichen's vast, enveloping photography exhibit, The Family of Man, which debuted at the Museum of Modern Art in 1955, and with funding from the U.S. Information Agency, traveled to dozens of other countries. In the late 50s and throughout the 60s, the vision took partial and fleeting form in the psychedelic multimedia be-ins and happenings of the Beats and Hippies. It also informed the counterculture's political aspirations. The Students for a Democratic Society, in its 1962 Port Huron statement, demanded that, quote, society be organized to encourage independence in men and provide the media for their common participation, end quote. Writing in the New Left Review in 1970, the influential German intellectual Hans Magnus Enzensberger predicted that as communication technology advanced, all forms of media would come together in a universal system that would be egalitarian in structure, giving the masses the means to mobilize to overthrow bourgeois culture. Beyond the high-toned museum exhibits, the dope-stoked festivals, and the radical theorizing, the ideal barely registered with the public. People were more devoted than ever to the one-to-many broadcasts coming out of their radios and TVs. The simple fact was that the technology required to create an interactive many-to-many communication system that could reach into private homes did not exist. The kind of democratic medium imagined by Mead and others lay outside the realm of the possible. But in Washington, D.C., a small group of computer scientists and network engineers working for the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, was about to fix that. And thus ends Chapter 2. In our next session, we will move into Chapter 3, which is titled The Feed. Chapter 3 of Superbloom, How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart by Nicholas Carr. Thank you for watching.